Good afternoon, everybody who's here in person and everybody who's also joining us online. We are going to move now from thinking about climate and carbon to thinking about nature and the contribution that the travel and tourism industry can make to conservation and nature recovery. Before I introduce the session, I'm hoping I can introduce my panel cohort, if you like, all of whom, except for Harold, as you can see, will be joining us online from the various parts of the world in which they are currently. We have a really diverse set of perspectives in the session today. I'll run through the list as we don't have any faces on screen at the moment. Justin Francis, a real pioneer of responsible travel and tourism, the founder of responsibletravel.com, and also a big thinker in this area. He was also one of the co-founders, along with Harold, of the World Responsible Tourism Awards, the latest round of which will be announced later on today. We have Jared Kite, who joins us from Steps Travel, and Jared leads for Steps their work on positive impact strategy. We have Michael Lutzeyer, who is the owner and founder of a destination in the Cape in South Africa that is also a pioneer of responsible tourism, big award winner, and again, a past winner of the Responsible Travel Awards. And also Farah Mokida, who is the executive director of the Anguilla National Trust in the Caribbean, representing the conservation sector, working alongside the industry to improve its performance. I'm going to ask our technology team, do we have our panel with us? We do. Fantastic. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? I can see waves, I can see quizzical frowns, but mostly smiles. That's great.
Loud and clear.
Fantastic. Since you're all here, I'm going to take a seat, and I can see you on the front here. Okay, so carbon, climate, it's pretty much headline news at the moment, particularly this week with the COP happening in Glasgow, but it's not the only environmental crisis in town. There's also the crisis around nature and nature depletion. Now, we generally love nature, and that's no more so than in travel and recreation that we undertake. Those of you who are here, if you walk out of this auditorium and turn back into the main event, the first thing you will see is a deer with huge antlers, and just behind it, a tiger peering intently at it. If you go a little further, you'll see dolphins leaping, and if you look up, you'll see a coral reef. It's a huge part of what we look forward to and what we value in our tourism. We love it. But also as a society, we rely on nature for so many of the things that keep our societies functioning. And yet it is those aspects of our society which is damaging nature to the point where it is seriously in crisis. 6 months from now, there'll be another COP, like the current climate COP happening in Glasgow. That'll be happening in China, and it will be focused on nature and nature recovery. The governments of the world will come together to figure out what they can do over the next decade. And eyes will be turning to business sectors as well. So tourism is a really interesting one, because travel and tourism has an interesting relationship with nature and conservation and wildlife, in that it can have such great positive contributions to it, because it relies on it as one of the products that keeps the sector going. It's something that is in such great demand. But equally, the pressure of tourism can have really serious negative implications. These are some of the things we're going to be thinking about in our session this afternoon, in the next 45 minutes or so. Now, certain parts of the world, wildlife conservation is seriously intertwined with tourism, in many ways relies on tourism for its income, its support, and perhaps no less so than in Africa, as many of us will know. I'd like to start, therefore, with Michael Lutzeyer. Michael, I hope you can hear me. Michael,
yes, loud and clear. And
fantastic.
Right.
Michael comes to us from, we're talking about nature, one of the richest places for nature on the planet, the Cape Floral Kingdom in South Africa, which is the richest place for plant life on the planet. And Michael has a destination, a resort there, which is working really hard to support the conservation of that environment and also the support to the communities around it. Now, we've just seen 18 months of pandemic that's really, really affected things negatively for the wildlife sector that relies on tourism in Africa. So, Michael, what I'd like to ask you is, you've lived through that. I'd be really interested in what those short-term challenges have been, whether you see any long-term persistence of those things, and what Grootbos, your organization as a pioneer, is doing to remain resilient in that space.
Okay, Matt, let me try answering. So for all of you that have followed this, it was, of course, a shock when on the 28th of March, lockdown was, and all of a sudden we had no tourists. And as you mentioned before, we have a foundation that is linked to Grotbos, and there was a big worry about our employees and obviously the foundation. How are we going to fund the foundation? Because the business is funding the foundation to a large degree because our guests pay a conservation levy, which flows through to the foundation, which enables us to do all this good work. So I think we were stunned, like with a lot of us, almost like a rabbit in the headlights. But it didn't take long when we rethought and said, okay, we've been through worse things, fires, we've been through the economic crisis in 2009, 2010. And so we started thinking, what can we do? And Grotbos has been in existence for over 25 years, the foundation for over 20 years. And so we went back to our original donors that have supported us over such a long time and thought, what can we do to not retrench the staff in the foundation? As you know, we have a big sports facility, we educate schools, we help the children in conservation, but this was all stopped due to COVID. There was no more contact. But something emerged which was critical. Not only we had lost our income, but a lot of people in Africa had lost their jobs. And not something like you having in Europe furlough, was literally no support from government. So we thought about this and said, how could we keep on employing the staff in the foundation? And so we raised a substantial amount of money from our founders that are helping us, and we started a soup kitchen. And up to today, we have done 640,000 meals. And it was just amazing that the sports coaches, the teachers, were cutting butternuts, cooking in pots, gigantic pots, cutting potatoes, trying to do vitamins. And the soup kitchen has been such a success that it's carrying on. Today, lots of people have found jobs, but it's still for the children and the elderly people. And in the conservation, we used this time, Matt, to say, right, what can we do? And we thought, you know what? Take this time to bring out a new guiding book. A book about the plants, flowers, the insects, the reptiles, and we took all conservationists and let them do bio blitzes and go out and document. And some great news has come out of that. We actually found a new species for science. It was an Indigofera coming from the pea family, a complete new species for science. And I think that's quite amazing. We documented insects, we put everything together. Now that tourism is coming back, we are hopeful. We are looking forward to going to the next level. And in this time, we also managed to become carbon negative. It's taken us a long time. So if you're looking at COVID as such, as I said, a rabbit in the headlights, we are now hoppling along. We're not racing along yet. We're hoppling along, but actually we are doing well. And thank you for inviting us to this program.
Michael, that's great to hear. It does sound like you've taken this period of crisis and uncertainty and done something really extraordinary with it. I love the focus on the guidebook, and anything that's finding new species is a really good thing. I'd like to turn to Jared. It's clear that interest in nature is definitely on the rise, and that is partly pandemic-driven, but partly beyond that. Here in the UK, for example, unlike where Michael is, we're probably one of the world leaders in nature depletion on our own doorstep. And yet we're beginning to see shifts towards a recovery, new innovation, new models, new things happening. And Jared, I'd be really interested from your perspective as a tour operator who takes people all over the world in terms of adventure and responsible travel and nature travel, and yet how those things are changing in terms of domestic opportunities. Are you seeing shifts that may be possibly pandemic driven, but may well persist? And the providers with opportunities for more positive contribution towards nature recovery from tourism?
Yes, thank you. And I'm now feeling hungry thanks to Michael and his talk about his soup kitchen and the cooking of squash and the like. But absolutely, we're seeing shifts. I mean, if you'd have said to me 5 years ago that Scotland would be in our top 3 selling destinations, I would have doubted you. But that's exactly what it is. And I'm excited by the prospects, I think, that exist both within the UK and closer to home. And I'll kick things off with a great quote from Oscar Wilde. "Stronger than 1,000 armies is an idea whose time has come." And that idea is rewilding. And I think rewilding gives not only the tourism industry, but biodiversity a real fighting chance. Why am I excited about rewilding? I think 2 things. Firstly, it's the opportunity for scale. It is something that can really be scaled up across the UK and across Western Europe. The other reason I'm excited about rewilding is that it has such collaboration across so many different stakeholders. And I just get the impression that all of the different jigsaw pieces are beginning to fall into place now with rewilding. So, there are opportunities now for farmers who have marginalized land to actually sell that land or rent that land for use to regenerate it, maybe to plant trees, maybe just to take it back to its natural state, whether that might be a wetland, for example. And there is opportunity now for finance and for businesses to actually put money into that venture to act as, to sequestrate carbon, for example. I mean, if you look at the Rewild estate company that has just launched last week, they've got backing to the tune of about 50 million from L'Oreal. So it shows that business is really waking up to the opportunities that exist. And it means, hopefully, that we can actually start to apply a universal value, a financial value, to the biodiversity that we have. Because sadly, I think that's the only way that we will really be able to protect it. And as you said, biodiversity in the UK is in a sorry state. The Natural History Museum, they launched recently their index, biodiversity intactness index. And across the world, the average intactness was 75%. In the UK, 53%. So, almost half of our biodiversity since the industrial and agricultural revolution has gone, it's depleted. So, we do need something like rewilding, which offers real innovation and opportunity for many, many stakeholders, tourism being a key stakeholder in that whole collaboration.
That's fantastic. Can you give us an example of the kind of attractions that you're seeing demand coming through for in this? I mean, rewilding is, about giving space back to nature in many ways. But what are the things that are drawing tourists to those kind of opportunities?
Most of the interest we've seen has been in places like the Highlands, Scottish Highlands, Romania, Abruzzo, the Apennines in Italy, in northern Spain and southern Spain. And I think a lot of people think of rewilding as sort of, putting wolves and bears back, wolves back into Scotland, for example. It's what catches the headlines. But it's more just about a philosophy of coexistence. And so, examples would be in the UK, for example, there's been some really interesting beaver reintroductions into Cornwall and Devon, pine martens in the Forest of Dean. Great wildcat project up in Allerdale, up in the Scottish Highlands. And I think what is happening is that people are starting to have a more nuanced and, dare I say it, more sophisticated view of nature tourism. It isn't just about that big cat and putting a tick in the box. It's looking at nature more holistically appreciating the whole of the ecosystem, as opposed just to some of the big starring roles, if you like.
That's fantastic. I think we're going to return to that a little bit later in this session. But I'd like now to turn to Farah Hi, Farah, how are you doing?
I am good.
Great to see you. Farah, as I said earlier, Farah is the director of the Anguilla National Trust in the Caribbean. And the Caribbean, I think it's true to say, is a destination that we don't necessarily traditionally think of as being a nature tourism destination at all. In fact, we might struggle to think of the Caribbean as being a place that's particularly rich in nature, and yet it is. Islands have an incredible diversity of wildlife that's very endemic, that's very specific to islands, but there's also highly threatened because it only exists in those places. And it's that side of conservation that I know, Farah, you and your organization and many other partners in the Caribbean are working on. Where do you see opportunities perhaps to engage with the more mainstream tourism economy that will be there on your doorstep in terms of raising awareness around nature and conservation, about bringing in participation and making a positive contribution?
Well, I think for most Caribbean destinations, and this is definitely true for Anguilla, one of the main draws for tourists is the idea of sea, sun, sand. And I can't speak for everyone, but for Anguilla, it's also about getting away from the crowds and immersing yourself in the peace and quiet and the laid-back nature of this very small island. But it's Anguilla's incredibly beautiful beaches and its turquoise waters and blue skies that underlie and support almost the entire tourism industry. So it's interesting when we say, this idea of tourism, nature-based tourism, being integrated into or mainstreaming it in Anguilla, when in fact the entire industry is actually based on nature. But there is this disconnect, I think, between ourselves and the industry and nature, with nature being just kind of an afterthought and not really being given sort of the level of appreciation that it should receive. But at the same time, at the tourist level, and as an organization that conducts tours and interacts with tourists, we've noticed that over the last few years, there has been an increase in interest amongst visitors to sort of see a different side of the island and to get away from the manicured landscapes and just the beaches themselves. So people want to go off the beaten track. They want to see things that are a little different and perhaps a little bit more authentic. And they often also want to actually participate in the work that we're doing. So they want to, release hatchlings into the sea. They might want to plant some trees or help us with the work that we're doing on our offshore islands. And it's those sort of meaningful experiences that they're looking for. And then they share those experiences with other visitors that they see on the island or on social media, or even with the people who are working in the hotels or the resorts that they're staying. And so it's these stories that can be so powerful, and they can also help us in sort of our higher level nature conservation advocacy work, where we want to call for better and more conscious and more intentional decisions to be made by the industry, and then also by the government that regulates that industry, and ensuring that it actually is mainstreamed more prominently into the actual operations and the decision-making processes. So I think for Anguilla, we're such a small island, it's a small population, and being able to access people who are working in the industry as well as the government usually isn't really difficult for us. So we can have these very open conversations about what the industry can do or how it can help support nature, heritage conservation work, and that's pretty easy. So, for example, just recently we launched a new bespoke sort of wildlife-friendly certification program for our hotels and resorts. And just by calling up a couple of the hotels, we managed to put them through that process and have them certified. We've published brochures for visitors for best practice. We've been working with the tourism boards and the Tourism Association to lobby government to make legislative change. So just recently, we were able to ban single-use plastics in Anguilla. I mean, it's a small thing, but it's something. And we also recognize that just given the current climate, a lot of the change and the significant changes that we're seeing are just they're moving in that direction, and not necessarily just by the choice of the industry themselves, it's the economics. So it makes economic sense to be transitioning into alternative energy. It makes economic sense to be buying local and supporting local businesses. What we're hoping is that this also transitions into something a little bit more community-based, where we're looking at taking nature-based solutions to issues related to climate change and sea level rise, instead of looking at those, hard engineering approaches and working with organizations that are doing that work. So I think that we are seeing some changes, positive changes, in the level of appreciation and awareness and the actions that are being taken by the industry, but there's still more that needs to be done for nature to become sort of intrinsically embedded in how the industry operates on Anguilla. But I'm hopeful that we'll get there, but we're just hoping that it'll be sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Farah. You've certainly given us a sense of optimism that there is some momentum there. I'm going to turn to Justin now. Justin, I believe you're in Glasgow at the moment at the start of the COP, so we'd love to hear how things are going from there. But in particular, turning to the issue of corporate responsibility more broadly, you've been involved now for a long, long time in responsible tourism and in pushing the industry. Be interested in your sense of how far you think we've come. And perhaps you can also reflect a little bit on, from your position with UK Government's Council for Sustainable Business, on what's being done to push the industry a little further.
Thank you, Matt. I'll be getting the train up to Glasgow on Friday for the climate summit. Matt, you mentioned that carbon is the focus of the climate summit, which is absolutely true. But we will see nature featuring prominently throughout the climate summit. The UK presidency is determined to elevate nature throughout the entire event, and there's a day dedicated to it. I'll be there on Saturday, which is Nature Day. And why is that? The reason is very simple, is the IPCC models and budgets for carbon make one critical assumption, and that is that nature remains intact, as it is now, to sequester carbon. So let's make this very simple. If we continue to lose nature at the rate we are, then no matter else that we do, we will not be able to deliver 1.5 degrees. So we need to change the view that we'll get round to nature once we've ticked off carbon. They're inextricably linked. If we continue to lose nature and its ability to sequester carbon, we cannot deliver 1.5 degrees. So for all of us on the call and in the room with you today, Matt, nature is going to become a much bigger focus for governments and businesses of all types as we move forwards. Over 90 governments, leaders from around the world have signed a commitment to arrest the declines in nature by 2030. We will arrest the declines in nature by 2030. Underneath that are other goals. For example, the commonly called 30 by 30 goal, which means that 30% of our land and sea mass will be under protection by 2030. Some countries are already there, but many will have some way to go. And more leaders are signing up to that commitment as well. At Responsible Travel, we've signed up to become nature positive by 2030. If you'd like to do so or learn what that means or learn more about the impacts and solutions for tourism, then please visit getnaturepositive.com and learn about Nature Positive, the impacts on tourism, and what Nature Positive by 2030 means. In terms of progress, Matt, and looking forward to the future, your question, I think that the nature-based tourism industry has done an increasingly good job of using its muscle, persuasive power, and sheer passion to protect nature. I mean, what Michael, Farah, and Jared are doing is exceptional and is extraordinary. But if we look at the biggest impacts on nature around the world, there's 5. It is land use change. It's the conversion of nature-rich land into other land, often agriculture and farming. It's the overexploitation of nature, it's pollution, it's climate change, and it's lastly non-native invasive species, the spread of non-native invasive species. Most of the negative impacts on tourism do not fall in the nature tourism sector. They fall outside of that. They fall in city tourism, plastics, pollution, waste, urban tourism. The food we eat across all of the tourism industry is contributing to deforestation, loss of orangutans, loss of habitats for nature of all types. So we've done a good job. And I share Jared's enthusiasm and Michael and Farah's great example about rewilding. It's fabulous. More power to all of you and to all of us who are behind that. But what we've got to do next, apart from supercharging your efforts, is tackle the mainstream tourism industry that's creating the majority of the impacts that fall across on nature. And that's where I see the next 5 years of work. For the nature tourism sector, let's contribute to 30 by 30. Let's get 30% of land under protection by 2030. We're one of the most influential industries in being able to create the economic case for that. And then we need to take our lobby and our example out more broadly.
Fantastic. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It's how do we get the whole of the industry building this into what they're doing? I'm going to turn to Harold on that point, since Harold is here, and it would be good to hear you. I know you will have views on this. In terms of what Justin's been talking about there, again, you've been an observer and commentator for many, many years, and fierce critic, I would say, of the industry. Do you see any really interesting developments and direction in terms of travel and tourism in its ability to lighten that footprint on nature, if you like, beyond the things we talked about in climate, but into...
Matt, you've done as I expected you would. You've got a great panel together, and these are great stories and great examples, but sadly they're not typical, are they? We know that. You and I did that research years and years ago now and discovered that ecotourism wasn't putting enough back into conserved areas. That's not the case with the ones we've been talking about here, but that's generally the case. And also there's the problem that communities who live with conserved areas bear a massive opportunity cost, and simply not enough goes to the local communities living around those conserved areas. And Michael, one of the reasons I'm so impressed by Group Boss is you've managed to do both. But that is rare. The other point I wanted to make though, Matt, in order to just be optimistic, because I don't want to get pessimistic today, it is very exciting, I think, to see what people can do, even in urban environments, Justin, when people begin to rewild around the hotel in an urban area, start to plant native species, and surprise, surprise, the native species of butterflies and insects and the birds come back. It is really a matter of managing habitat. There's nothing more ridiculous in a way for a hotel wanting to reduce its carbon emissions to be planting the wrong kind of plants and then having to cut the grass to keep it like a bowling green, when in fact that just kills all the wildlife that might be there. It just doesn't make any kind of economic or environmental sense. And I think there's a massive task to be done encouraging traditional hotels in urban areas, many of them, to revert to rewilding. And we, you know, Matt, you and I both know that they're developing, I think the honey on the roofs of hotels may be a bit full of lead, but nonetheless, they are managed to make honey now on the roofs of hotels. That's the kind of urban environment that we need to see being rewilded. It's fantastic what's happening here, but we can be doing the same things in urban spaces.
I think you're absolutely spot on. I'd like to actually bring that point out to Farah, because obviously, you know, again, within the Caribbean, it's beautiful beachfront, seafront tourism hotels, complexes, often landscaped in ways that are not using native plants and perhaps aren't having that positive contribution that Harold's talking about. Are you seeing any shift there in the Caribbean in that context?
So I can't speak for everywhere, but in Anguilla, I mean, it's true. There are the smaller boutique type resorts and hotels are moving more towards, you know, native plants, maintaining natural vegetation, where, and then it's the larger hotels, which are the ones who are doing more of the, you know, manicured, bring in what's beautiful or what they consider to be beautiful but may not be appropriate onto the properties. And I think there's just this misconception that people want to see that, like they want to see the manicured lawns and they want to see the plants that they're used to seeing, when in fact, part of the experience of going somewhere different is to see something different and to experience it as it is. So instead of trying to recreate in Anguilla like a Miami experience, we should be trying to create the Anguilla experience. But we are working with hotels, and it's similar to this whole rewilding movement. We are doing that as well. And we're hoping over the next 3 years that we'll be able to work more closely with hotels to provide them with, provide them with the actual plants that they need to be making their properties more natural in terms of what is considered natural for Anguilla.
Fantastic. Now,
it's slow, but it is happening.
Of course, of course. There's a lot of talk, I guess, about thinking about where does the pressure come from to make the kind of transitions that we're talking about. And Jared, I'd be interested, from your perspective and what you may be hearing from travelers and tourists themselves, is the consumer, him or herself, a force for potential shift and change here? Are you hearing anything about preferences and motivations and willingness to accept different choices?
No question that people have changed in terms of what they want. They want their travel to be a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. And I think moving forward sort of 2 years on after the pandemic, people understand that traveling, especially to areas, biodiversity hotspots and beautiful wild places, is a privilege and not a right, and that's something that needs to be earned. I think it's really incumbent upon the industry to help, to really take that positivity and that willingness that is out there in the marketplace, and to inform. And I always think it's quite pompous when we say about we need to educate the market, but I think that is what is required, because there is definitely a receptiveness to this message. There is a willingness from clients to do the right thing, but it's complicated. I think we need to make it simple for them to do the right thing. Ultimately what it's about is making people realize that traveling sustainably doesn't have to be a compromise. Far from it. It can actually enhance the experience. So, let's look at having longer trips with a bit more purpose. Let's look at slow travel rather than moving, 2 nights here, 2 nights there. Let's go to Grootbos and stay the whole 7 days, the whole week of your holiday, and really immerse yourself in the Fynbos and all of the wonderful, the wine cellar that Michael has is pretty good too. But yes, there is definitely a willingness from the market to do things differently, and it's up to tour operators, it's up to the industry to really capitalize on that willingness and that receptiveness to hear what we've got to say, to make their travels more sustainable. Because at the end of the day, what this is all about is we want our clients to be able to continue to travel. We want them to be able to take their grandchildren on that special holiday. That's what we're trying to explain to our clients. We're just trying to help you continue doing what you love doing, but it's going to take a bit of change. It's going to take some cooperation and some good conversations. But if we do that, if we collaborate like that, then we will get there.
Jared, you've reassured me. I just want to be able to take my kids. They're getting to an age now where they would love to go to Africa. They'd love to go down and see what Michael's up to. They'd love to go to the Caribbean too. But I sit here with a lot of guilt, about that because of all the things we've already heard and how to make that work. And I guess what you're saying is where there are destinations that can really demonstrate that they're making a positive difference, and where we can make choices to reduce our footprint as we go, then we should be feeling guilty about that. We should be taking that opportunity and and doing the right thing.
I think, I wouldn't be here if I didn't wholeheartedly believe that the positive benefits of sustainable travel can outweigh the negative impacts of carbon. And I think what we need to do as an industry is work towards substantiating that belief. And I don't know whether we're going to talk about calculators and how we measure my belief that I've just articulated there. But I think that's really important. I think it's a combination of good communication, transparency, openness, storytelling, but that has to be substantiated with some scientific-based facts. And
you're
it's the
absolutely
old
right.
adage
You're
of,
absolutely right. And that whole issue around measurement and disclosure has got to be one of the pillars of responsibility. Michael, Fruit Boss, I think, has been, again, a real leader in being able to determine its targets, measure its contributions in all kinds of ways, whether it's to communities and poverty reduction, whether it's to environmental performance in all sorts of ways. And yet it still seems to be quite a marginal thing within the industry. It's not everybody that's doing this. How have you made that happen? And what do you see perhaps as being some of the real, the really key indicators for what we're talking about in terms of tourism's contribution to nature recovery?
I think what you just said is so important, and I want to carry on what Jared and Justin said. If it becomes more transparent, where people are traveling to, that the people are not just giving lip service, but they are looking after their communities. They are looking after the environment. They're looking after the culture that is happening. And our tour operators and people that are traveling to us trust us and become, because we are transparent. And I think that's what we've been doing over the past 10 years. We've documented everything. Doesn't mean we have to document it scientifically, but we've set ourselves goals in all these departments on a regular basis, which we visit each year. And as an example, say, let's take solar. Where would Grootbos like to be in 10 years? Of course, we can't afford solar in one go. But in 10 years, we would like to be off the grid. So if you measure yourself continuously, and we get next year to 30% off the grid, then we are going forward. And it's the tour operators and the rest of the world that is pushing and saying, you should go to sustainable places. And it's important about the stories that we all tell about conservation, about the plant, about the nature, about that beaver that you were talking about. So the children go back and say, I learned stories. I've got a story in my heart. And I think that's what it is about.
Fantastic. We'll be coming to see you as soon as we can. Justin, how do we get the rest of the industry doing the kind of thing that Michael's describing? Measuring and disclosing, allowing consumers and other parts of the industry to make informed choices.
Well, I think that there's a job around inspiration, but also I think increasingly we'll see regulation. In the UK now, I won't be able to buy a petrol-driven car beyond a certain date. They will not be allowed to buy a gas boiler for my home. As we start to see the push down from governments into nature and protecting nature, we'll see more and more regulation. So if you're a travel company, you better get with it now, because you'll be forced to otherwise. The other thing just to note, nature, as you know, Matt, can prove difficult to measure. It's different than a ton of carbon, more complicated. But next year, there will be published the science-based targets for nature. It will give businesses, initially large and then small, a kind of unified dashboard of the types of things that they can record. I think Michael's got it right. Start now. Wait for that. Start now. Start to identify the things that you may be doing to impact negatively on nature. Set yourself some goals, but there will be more rigorous targets to follow. And then, of course, there will be both the cheerleading of best practice and the embarrassment of those who are not contributing, compounded by regulation.
I think you're spot on there. Absolutely right. Team, this has been fantastic, but we are drawing towards the end of our allotted time. So I want to ask you each briefly one question, and I'll come to each of you in turn to answer this. In your view, what is the single most important thing that the travel and tourism industry can do to contribute more to conservation and nature recovery? Jared, I'm going to come to you first, since you're top left on my screen.
I think it's about numbers, it's about consumption. We've got to stop looking at volume and we've got to start looking at value and yield. Tourism contributes, something like 8% of the world's carbon emissions. International travelers are expected to reach something like 1.8 billion in 2030, or they certainly were pre-pandemic. The tragedy of the commons might well be our epitaph if we don't do something to try and control that. And I think Justin is absolutely right. It needs government regulation, command and control sort of measures, but it also needs market-based instruments as well. For me, capping numbers and having some sort of consistency with how we value nature, give you an example of where there is inconsistency, $1,500 for an hour with mountain gorillas in Rwanda, $100 for up to a month in the Galapagos. We need to start attaching a realistic value to nature. People need to start paying for that privilege of seeing nature and being in nature. And we need to do what we can to control the numbers, the footfall.
Fantastic. Michael, very briefly over to you.
Could just say the same what Jared is saying. We've introduced a conservation levy, which the guest can see where it goes back, he can measure it. And I think that will also be part of the future. It's not easy to look after nature. To look after nature as a responsibility and also costs money. And so I think for the guest to help, to contribute, and give him newsletters and tell him where his money is going to, will make him interact with you, will make him feel good at heart. And if he parts with a few pounds, that will make him just feel good and help us all.
I think you're spot on. Fantastic. Farah, let me turn to you.
So I agree with what Jared is saying. I mean, in Anguilla, it does focus on low volume, high quality tourism experiences. But tourism is absolutely essential to the economy. I mean, if we don't have it, I think Anguilla's nature would actually be far worse off. So from a local and more practical perspective, I think one of the most important things the industry can do is actually work with organizations and agencies on the ground to support our conservation efforts. So that means, like prioritizing or investing in priority national nature conservation initiatives, in supporting and contributing to data and monitoring programs so that we can start making informed, adaptive conservation management interventions and strategies, and encouraging guests and staff to take part and volunteer on nature-based projects, and adopting and implementing policies that conserve species and habitats, and regardless of whether or not those policies are legislated.
Fantastic.
So
I can certainly subscribe to that.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. And finally, Justin.
I agree with everything that's been said. Just to add something additional. The biggest reason we're losing nature worldwide is land use change. Nearly 40% of the world's land mass is farmed. Isn't that incredible? 40% of the entire Earth's land mass is farmed, and it's growing. And that's why there's no room for nature. So we literally need to take wildlife off the plates that we're serving to guests. If we've got intensively produced meat and lots of dairy on there, we are literally killing wildlife by what we're eating. Somewhere down the line, a forest is going down, it's being converted, and nature is being lost. So the food we eat, the food we serve is critical for protecting more land for nature, and it's one of the biggest contributors of carbon emissions as well. So the food we serve is critical.
Fantastic. That is a great place, I think, to wrap up. Some phenomenal ideas there. So Justin, Jared, Michael, Farah, our panel today, thank you ever so much for your inputs, for joining us. Round of applause from the audience here. You've made this a really dynamic session. I also would like to thank all of the technical team who have also made the connections work. They have been faultless from wherever you are in the world. So thank you. Thank you to the audience here and online. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.